"That's wrong!" the barefoot girl shouted from the back of the room. Her voice cut through the hum of conversation and the crackle of the cheap microphone. "It's going to twist apart." The words hung there for a moment, floating over the heads of the crowd in the community hall. A few people turned to see who had spoken. She stood near the fogged-up window, small for her age, her bare toes curled against the cold linoleum floor. The hem of her faded cotton dress was torn in places, and a second-hand sweater hung loose on her narrow shoulders. A braid fell over one side of her head, tied at the end with a bit of red thread that looked like it had once been part of someone's sewing kit. The young man at the front of the room, one of the engineers leading the demonstration, looked momentarily startled. He was tall, thin, and wore a gray hoodie under a clean lab coat, as though unsure which role he belonged to. He glanced toward his colleagues, then back to the girl. "What makes you say that?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. The girl looked down at her hands for a moment, then met his eyes with surprising steadiness. "If you braid it wrong, it twists into itself and comes loose." A ripple of amusement spread through the room. Someone in the front row chuckled. Another whispered something to their neighbor, something about kids and their imagination. "Hair?" the young man repeated. She nodded once. "The tether is like hair. Twist too long in one direction and it pulls against itself until it breaks." More laughter followed. To the rest of the audience, mostly parents and curious locals, it was an odd, almost comical thing to say. The demonstration was about the future of orbital mechanics, about high-strength materials designed to keep a space station stable in the vacuum of space. What could braiding hair possibly have to do with that? The young man, though, didn't laugh. He had been working with the model all week, checking every connector, every tension point. He'd seen the cable strain under certain angles, but never thought of it in terms of a braid. Before he could ask more, the lead engineer called for the next segment of the presentation. The young man turned away reluctantly. The girl slipped back into the shadow of the doorway, her words still hanging in his mind. The rest of the evening passed in polite small talk and lukewarm applause. Coffee was poured from tall metal urns. The few children who had come were given cheap plastic keychains shaped like satellites. By the time the young man left the hall, the street outside was dark. The cold air smelled faintly of rain. He walked quickly, his thoughts circling back to her voice, small but sharp, like the pluck of a violin string. "If you braid it wrong..." He arrived back at the testing center well after the rest of the staff had gone home. The place was quiet except for the steady hum of the servers. Under the dim fluorescent lights, he booted up the simulation software and recreated the tether design from earlier that day. But this time he adjusted the parameters: uneven load distribution, slow rotational drift, slight asymmetry in the anchor points. He ran the model, watching the graphics on the screen. At first, the cable held. Then the torque readings began to rise, a red curve creeping upward on the chart. On the visual model, the tether began to curl, not in a dramatic snap, but in a slow, insistent twist. The stress localized at one joint. The joint failed. "Failure," flashed the simulation log. He stared. That could have been chance, some quirk in the parameters. He reset and ran it again. Same pattern, same twist, same failure. He leaned back, the metal chair creaking under his weight. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to unsettle him. Enough to make him see the model differently. The next morning, he drove toward the edge of the city, where the streets gave way to dusty ground and the wind seemed to carry grit into your teeth. The refugee settlement lay just beyond a chain-link fence with its gate hanging open. Rows of metal containers sat on bare earth, their paint faded and peeling. Between them, ropes strung with patched laundry sagged in the breeze. Children played in the dirt, some barefoot, some wearing mismatched shoes. They stopped to stare as the car pulled in. The young man stepped out, scanning for the familiar braid of hair tied with red thread. He found her sitting on the curb beside one of the containers. Another girl, younger by a few years, sat patiently while she worked through her hair. The older girl's fingers moved with quiet precision, dividing the hair into 3 neat strands, looping them over and under with a practiced rhythm. Halfway down the braid, she did something unusual. She swapped the 2 outer strands before continuing. The young man crouched nearby. "Why change the pattern in the middle?" She didn't look up. "If you don't change the rhythm, the strands start to twist into each other. They tangle and the braid gets weak." She paused, then added, "Like your tether yesterday." His breath caught slightly. "You recognized me?" This time she looked at him, her dark eyes calm and matter-of-fact. "You're the one who asked me why." For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the wind whistled between the metal walls of the containers, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from a cooking fire. He thought of the simulation from the night before, of the red curve rising steadily, the failure point flashing. And then he thought of her small hands, interrupting the pattern just enough to keep the strands balanced. It was not luck. It was not a guess. She had seen the flaw instinctively, in the same way some people could hear a note gone flat in a song or sense the tilt of a floor just by standing still. The girl tied off the braid with the red thread, giving it a firm little tug to test its strength. The younger child hopped up and ran off toward the other kids. The girl remained sitting, pulling her knees up under her sweater. He wanted to ask where she had learned it, who had taught her to braid this way. But there was a dignity in her quiet that made him hold back. Instead, he simply said, "I'd like to show you something at my lab. Something about the tether." She didn't answer right away. She glanced toward a small, stooped figure emerging from one of the containers, an older woman with a scarf wrapped around her head. The woman watched them with cautious eyes. "That's my grandmother," the girl said. He raised a hand in greeting, then spoke gently. "Could I talk to her? I think you can help us with something important." The girl studied his face for a moment, as if weighing whether he was serious. Then she stood, brushing the dust from her dress, and led him across the yard. The grandmother listened in silence as he explained, carefully, without too much technical jargon, about the model, the simulation, the failure. He told her that the girl's observation might hold the key to improving the design. When he finished, the old woman looked at her granddaughter, then back at him. "If she goes, I go too," she said. Her voice was firm but not unfriendly. "Of course," he said. And so, a few minutes later, they were walking toward his car, the girl with her braid, the red thread dancing in the breeze, the grandmother keeping a steady pace beside her. He couldn't help but glance at the thread again. In his mind, he saw it stretching out across the blackness of space, a tether holding something far larger than a child's braid together. Something told him that this was only the beginning. The lab smelled faintly of machine oil and the ozone bite of overworked electronics. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their white glare bouncing off stainless steel work tables. The junior engineer, his name was Daniel, swiped his badge at the side door and ushered Lena and her grandmother inside. Lena paused just past the threshold, her bare toes curling against the cold, polished floor. Her dark eyes moved slowly over the room, the tall racks of equipment, the spools of high-tensile cable stacked neatly along the wall, the computer screens alive with floating diagrams of tethers and orbital paths. To Daniel, it was all familiar, comfortably cluttered with the tools of his trade. But to her, it was a forest of strange machinery. "This way," Daniel said, gesturing toward the long central bench. In the middle of it lay the scale model tether, 2 weighted blocks, one large to represent the station core, the other smaller to stand in for a supply vessel. Between them stretched the cable, 3 thin strands twisted into a single braid. He began explaining, more to the grandmother than to Lena at first. The tether is designed to resist both tensile force, pulling along its length, and torsional stress, which is twisting. The problem is, in orbit, those stresses aren't constant. The rotation of the station can introduce something we call cumulative torsional load. Over time, it can cause failure at the weakest joint. Lena stepped closer. Her small hands hovered above the model without touching it. She looked at the cable the way another child might look at a puzzle. "You twist in the same direction all the way," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Yes, that's how it's been designed." She looked up at him. "That's why it will break." The grandmother made a small sound, half warning, half pride. Daniel smiled faintly. "Show me what you would do differently." From a drawer, he pulled a fresh length of test cable. It was thin, but strong, the same material used in the real prototypes. He handed it to Lina, who took it gingerly, feeling the slight give in its fibers. She separated the strands into 3 equal sections and began braiding. At first, she worked in the same rhythm as the original cable, left over center, right over center. But after a set number of passes, she broke the pattern, swapping the 2 outer strands before continuing. Daniel leaned in. "How often do you change the pattern?" "Every so many steps," she said, counting in her head. "Long enough to keep the twist from building up, but not so long that it starts again." To anyone else, it might have seemed like a simple trick, but Daniel could see the mechanics in it. Each change reversed the residual torque in the cable, canceling out the cumulative twist before it could travel down the length. When she finished, he anchored the ends into the model and set the simulator's stress test in motion. The motor began turning the smaller block in slow, controlled revolutions, applying both pull and twist. The cable held. At 10 minutes, there was no sign of torque buildup on the readout. At 20, the numbers wavered but stayed within safe limits. By 30, the original design would have shown a clear upward curve into failure. Lena's braid remained stable. They weren't alone for long. A door at the far end of the lab opened, and a man in a pressed white lab coat stepped in. He was older, his hair gray at the temples, his expression sharp. Dr. Keene, one of the senior researchers, wasn't known for patience. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Daniel straightened. "Running a torsional stress comparison with a modified braid pattern." Keene's gaze shifted to Lena. "And where did this modification come from?" Daniel hesitated. "From her." The silence that followed was long enough to draw heat into Daniel's face. Keene glanced between the child and the cable, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "You're telling me you're testing a design suggested by an 8-year-old? "It's holding better than the standard pattern," Daniel said evenly. "That's not the point." Keene stepped closer to the bench. "In this field, design changes come from vetted research, from documented experiments. Not playground analogies." Lena didn't flinch under his stare. She simply said, "It's not an analogy. It's the same thing." Keene's mouth tightened. "This is a lab, not a classroom for street tricks." Daniel opened his mouth to argue, but Keene raised a hand, signaling the end of discussion. "Shut it down. I don't want this on the testing docket." For a moment, Daniel considered ignoring the order. But the grandmother's hand had closed protectively over Lena's shoulder, and he knew this wasn't the time. He powered down the model, the hum of the motor fading into silence. Keene left without another word. When the door shut, Daniel exhaled slowly. "He's old school," he said. Lena looked at him. "Then how will you fix the cable?" He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "By running the right test at the right time. We just have to find that time." She nodded as if that were enough. and maybe for her it was. The alley was not much more than a gap between two warehouse buildings. Sunlight only touched the cracked pavement for an hour or two each day. The smell of engine oil and stale bread lingered in the air, carried on a breeze that seemed to whisper in and out of the narrow space. Daniel spotted her from the street. Lena sat cross-legged on an old shipping crate, braiding the hair of another child who was perched on an overturned bucket. The girl in the bucket giggled every time Lena's fingers tickled her scalp. Daniel slowed his steps, not wanting to break the rhythm of what he was seeing. Her hands moved with the same calm precision he had watched in the lab, dividing, looping, and tightening the strands. Midway through, she paused, shifted the outer sections, and continued, her fingers moving like she was following a music only she could hear. The younger girl hopped down when Lena finished, running to a group of children at the far end of the alley. Lena remained where she was, brushing loose strands from her lap. Daniel approached, crouching so his eyes were level with hers. "You're doing it again," he said. She looked at him without surprise. "Doing what?" "Changing the pattern in the middle." Her mouth curved just slightly, something between a smile and the beginning of one. "That's how you keep it from twisting too tight. You can't just pull one way forever." Daniel leaned back on his heels. "And you figured that out yourself?" "Not just me," she said. "My grandmother taught me the first braid. I just tried it different when my friend's hair kept tangling." There was a simple honesty to her words, no hint of pride or apology. It was just the truth of how things had happened. The afternoon light shifted, glancing off the damp wall behind her. Somewhere above, a laundry line swayed gently, its clothes pinned with mismatched clips. The sound of a radio drifted faintly from an open window. Static, then a burst of music. Daniel sat down on the crate across from her. "Do you braid every day?" She nodded. "Sometimes for the other girls, sometimes for my grandmother, sometimes for me." "Why the red thread?" he asked, gesturing to the piece tied at the end of her own braid. Her fingers touched it lightly. "It doesn't slip like ribbon." And it was all we had. Daniel looked away for a moment, pretending to study the wall, but in truth he was trying to steady the knot in his chest. He was used to labs, data, technical briefs, worlds where problems were solved by calculations, not by hands making something hold together out of nothing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small coil of cable, the same type used in the lab tests. "This is what we use for the tether," he said, offering it to her. She turned it over in her hands, bending it slightly, feeling the give. "It's heavy," she murmured. "It has to be," he said. "Strong enough to hold, light enough not to weigh down the station. We test it for months, but sometimes we still get it wrong." She met his eyes. "Then why not braid it right?" Daniel laughed softly, not at her, but at how plainly she said it. "That's what I'm trying to convince my team to do." They sat for a while without speaking. The alley was quieter now, most of the children having drifted off. Lena rested her chin on her knees, watching a patch of sunlight shrink against the far wall. Daniel finally stood. "Will you come back to the lab? Not today. Another day, when it's safe to work without too many people watching." "Why me?" she asked. "Because you see things the rest of us don't," he said simply. She thought about that for a long moment, then shrugged as though the decision was not hers to make. "You'll have to ask my grandmother." Daniel nodded. "I will." As he left the alley, he glanced back once. Lena was still sitting on the crate, the red thread at the end of her braid catching the last rays of sunlight like a thin flame in the shadows. The lab at the edge of the city was a long rectangular room built for precision, not beauty. Its walls were lined with tall racks of tools and coiled cables. Its floor was polished concrete, cool underfoot. The air smelled faintly of machine oil, cold metal, and the faint tang of ozone from the testing equipment. Fluorescent lights cast a steady white glow that never flickered, making every shadow sharp and clear. Daniel had brought Lena and her grandmother in early, before the other researchers arrived. He knew the room could turn hostile once the day began, and wanted a quiet window in which Lena could work without interruption. Her grandmother moved with deliberate care, her scarf pulled tight around her head, eyes scanning the space like someone stepping into unknown territory. Lena, in contrast, walked forward slowly but without hesitation, her bare toes touching the polished floor, her eyes taking in every corner. On the central workbench sat the scale model tether, 2 weighted blocks, one large to represent the station core, the other smaller for the supply vessel, linked by a short length of braided cable. On the shelf behind it sat coils of unused cable, neatly wound. Daniel unspooled one of those coils and placed it in front of her. "Show me your braid," he said. Lena picked up the cable. Her fingers felt for the natural bend in each strand, adjusting the lay so they lay evenly. She divided the 3 strands and began to work, left over center, right over center, her rhythm steady and unhurried. After a short sequence, she made a subtle change. The 2 outer strands switched places before she continued. Daniel leaned closer. "You change the pattern at fixed points, don't you?" She nodded. "Every so many steps. Not too soon, not too late." For a moment, Daniel's mind shifted to the equations behind her instinct. In cable mechanics, cumulative torsional load could be modeled by adding incremental twist vectors along the length. By reversing the braid rhythm at intervals, you'd create countervectors that canceled the accumulated torque before it concentrated at a joint. He could see the math in her hands even though she never wrote a number. When she tied off the braid, Daniel anchored it to the model. He switched on the motor that simulated the station's slow rotation, applying steady tension and torsion to the cable. Numbers began scrolling on the monitor. Torque readings, strain percentages, micro-vibration data from sensors embedded in the joint housings. He watched the torque curve stay almost flat, steady in a way the original braid design had never been. At the 10-minute mark, still steady. 15 minutes, barely a tremor. Daniel felt a quiet surge of relief. They were on to something real. The door at the far end of the lab swung open. The sound of polished shoes on concrete announced Dr. Keene before Daniel even saw him. 2 other researchers followed, tablets in hand. Keene's eyes swept the room and stopped on Lena. "So this is the famous braiding expert I've been hearing about," he said, his voice dry. Daniel kept his tone even. "We're running a modified braid test. It's holding far better than the standard configuration." Keene's gaze slid to the monitor, then back to Daniel. "Modified by whom?" Daniel hesitated. "By her." One of the researchers gave a short, incredulous laugh. Keene stepped closer to the bench. "You're telling me that after years of engineering review, your improvement comes from, what, hair braiding?" Daniel shook his head. "It's not just hair braiding. It's a method for canceling torsion. Every reversal in the braid pattern neutralizes the residual twist before it travels the length of the tether. It's the same principle used in some load-bearing ropes, only we've never applied it here." Keene's jaw tightened. "We have procedures for this. A design change requires documented research, peer-reviewed analysis, and multiple layers of approval. We don't alter a spaceflight component because an 8-year-old says so." Lena's grandmother shifted, but before she could speak, Lena herself answered, her voice calm and clear. "It's not because I said so. It's because it works." For a moment, silence settled over the room. The hum of the motor filled the space, steady and unbroken, as if the cable itself were backing her claim. Keene's expression hardened. "Shut it down." Daniel stared at him. "The data's right there. Look at the torque stability. You've never seen a curve that flat in this setup. I said shut it down, Keene repeated, his tone final. Remove it from the test docket. This lab is not here to entertain folk wisdom. And Daniel, don't waste my time again. Daniel's fingers hovered over the stop controls. He could almost feel the cable wanting to keep going, holding its form without strain. Every instinct told him to leave the motor running, to force Keene to watch the numbers stay steady. But Lena was looking at him, not pleading, just watching. Her grandmother's hand rested on her shoulder in a quiet gesture of restraint. He powered the motor off. The hum faded, the cable stilled. Keene turned and left, the other researchers following, their tablet screens casting faint glows on their faces. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving the lab feeling larger and emptier than before. Daniel let out a breath. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Lena tilted her head. You can't pull one way forever, she murmured. It was half observation, half warning. Daniel walked her and her grandmother to the lab's side door. In the hallway, they passed a display case of older models, early tether designs that had failed under test. One had snapped cleanly in the middle, another had twisted itself into a tangled spiral before breaking. Lena slowed her steps, studying them. These broke because they didn't change the rhythm? She asked. Daniel nodded. Sometimes the twist built up so slowly we didn't notice until it was too late. In space, that can be dangerous. There's no easy way to fix a tether once it's deployed. She didn't answer, but her eyes lingered on the broken cables as they walked past. Outside, the wind was sharp. The grandmother pulled her scarf tighter. Lena's braids swayed in the gusts, the red thread catching a glint of sunlight. Daniel crouched so he was eye level with her. We'll try again, he said. Maybe not here, maybe not with them watching, but we'll find a way to prove it. Lena gave the smallest of nods. You have to change the pattern before it's too late, she said. Daniel almost smiled. Yes, exactly that. As they walked toward the street, he glanced back at the lab building, its walls plain and unremarkable, hiding the quiet battle that had just taken place inside. He had the distinct sense that if they didn't act soon, the idea might be taken without them. And Daniel was beginning to realize that Lena wasn't just pointing out flaws in cables. She was teaching him something about the rhythm of fighting for an idea, too. A week later, Daniel received the email. You are invited to attend the final presentation of the improved tether configuration for submission to the Orbital Safety Board. No mention of who would be presenting. No mention of the source of the improvement. He read it twice, a flicker of hope rising despite his suspicion. Maybe Keene had reconsidered. Maybe the board would see the data, and Lena's braid would finally get its chance. The conference room at headquarters was nothing like the lab. It was all polished glass and chrome, the air faintly perfumed by the building's ventilation system. A long table stretched under recessed lighting, every seat already occupied by engineers, administrators, and a handful of uniformed representatives from the space agency. At the front, a large screen displayed a clean diagram of the tether. 3 strands, regular intervals, reversed twist sections. Lena's pattern, unmistakable. Daniel's stomach sank. Dr. Keene stood at the podium, his voice smooth. Over the last month, our team has developed a revised braiding protocol for the orbital tether. This configuration mitigates cumulative torsional stress by alternating the lay of the strands at calculated intervals, preserving joint integrity over long-duration missions. The technical explanation was accurate. Word for word, it was Lena's method, dressed in formal language. But as Keene continued, there was no mention of the girl, no reference to the camp, no acknowledgement of where the idea had come from. Daniel felt his hands curl into fists beneath the table. He glanced toward the side of the room where a few junior staff were taking notes. None of them knew the truth. Keene clicked to the next slide, simulation graphs. The torque curve was flat, just as it had been in Daniel's early test. As you can see, the new protocol maintains stability for over 30% longer than the current standard. This could mean a significant reduction in maintenance cycles for orbital stations. The board members murmured approval. One of them, an older man with silver hair, asked, "How did your team arrive at this solution?" Keen smiled, the kind of smile that filled the space between truth and lie. "We reviewed failure data from the last 3 missions and applied insights from cross-industry rope technology. The rest was standard iteration." Standard iteration. Daniel kept his face still, but inside he felt something snap. Not anger alone, but a deep, slow-burning disbelief that someone could erase another person so easily. When the meeting broke for coffee, Daniel stepped outside, phone in hand. He scrolled through the short video he'd taken weeks earlier. Lena's hands moving over the cable in the lab, the quiet confidence in her voice as she explained why the twist had to change. For a moment, he considered sending it to one of the younger engineers he trusted. But a thought stopped him cold. If the wrong person saw it first, it could vanish, buried under official reports and locked away as classified material. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. This needed the right timing. From the back of the room, as Keen resumed his presentation, Daniel saw the cable sample displayed on the podium. Lena's braid, down to the number of steps between reversals. Keen was even holding it the way Daniel had shown Lena to display it for the sensors. It was like watching someone wear a coat that didn't belong to them, moving as if it fit perfectly, when Daniel knew every stitch was someone else's work. That night, back in his apartment, Daniel sat at his small kitchen table. He replayed the video again and again, the sound of her voice a steady counterpoint to the silence of the room. You can't pull one way forever. He realized she had been right about more than cables. If he kept letting Keen control the narrative, it would twist and tighten until it snapped, and by then, there would be no way to repair it. 2 days after the presentation, Daniel was still carrying the weight of it. Keen's smooth voice, the stolen diagrams, the approving nods from the board. The image of Lena's braid on that podium had burned into his mind. He was pouring coffee in the lab's break room when someone cleared their throat behind him. "Daniel?" He turned to see a woman he recognized from the Space Agency's Materials Science Division. She was older, with hair the color of iron and eyes that seemed to measure more than they revealed. "I heard about your revised braid protocol," she said. "And I heard it didn't come from Dr. Keen." Daniel hesitated. "That's correct." She nodded as if she'd already known. "We're holding an open rebuttal session next week, an informal forum where anyone can challenge a presented solution with their own evidence. No titles, no seniority, just data." Daniel set the coffee down. "And you want—" "I want the real designer to show it," she said. When Daniel arrived at the camp that evening, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the dirt. Lena was sitting on the steps of a container, repairing a frayed basket handle with a needle and thread. "Lena," he said, kneeling to meet her eyes, "there's a chance for you to show your braid to people who can't ignore it." She kept working, pulling the thread tight before answering. "I don't like big rooms." "I know," he said, "but this isn't about the room. It's about making sure the truth is seen. You won't have to use numbers or charts, just your hands. Just braid, like you always do." She looked up at him. "And if they laugh?" Daniel thought of Keen's smirk, the polite chuckles at the community hall weeks ago. "Then let them laugh. They'll stop when they see it work." The day of the session, the forum hall was already filling when Daniel and Lena arrived. Long tables lined the sides, piled with models, cables, and laptops. At the center was a space cleared for demonstrations. Lena stayed close to Daniel, her eyes scanning the room without lingering on any one face. She wore the same dress, freshly washed, and her braid tied with its red thread. When their turn came, Daniel stood back. "Go ahead," he said softly. She stepped into the open space. A low murmur rippled through the room. Curiosity, disbelief. The kind of whisper that asks, "What is a child doing here?" On the table before her lay a coil of standard tether cable. She picked it up, separated the strands, and began braiding. Her fingers moved with quiet certainty, reversing the pattern at precise intervals. She didn't rush. She didn't falter. When she tied the braid, she spoke. Not loud, but clear. "Hair or cable, it doesn't matter. If you twist in one direction for too long, it pulls against itself and weakens. Change the rhythm, and the force balances." Daniel connected her braid to the small motorized model they'd brought. The motor began its slow rotation, the sensors tracking strain and torque. On the monitor, the torque curve stayed flat. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Not a flicker. The murmurs in the room shifted. Less doubt now, more attention. Someone at the back began filming. After 20 minutes, Daniel stopped the test. The braid was unmarked, every strand in place. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from one side of the room, applause began, slow at first, then growing. Not everyone clapped, but enough did for the sound to carry. As they stepped down, Lena glanced up at Daniel. Her voice was almost a whisper. "They didn't laugh." "No," he said. "They didn't." He knew the video would be online within hours. And once it was, Keene's version of the story would start to unravel, strand by strand. The video spread faster than Daniel could have imagined. It started as a shaky, grainy recording from the back of the rebuttal hall. The camera had been held by a student, just high enough to see over the heads in front. Lena stood at the center of the frame, small, barefoot, the red thread at the end of her braid swaying faintly as she worked. Her hands moved over the cable with the same quiet assurance she'd shown in the lab. Left over center, right over center, the subtle reversal, the finish. The sound in the clip was clear enough to catch her words. "Hair or cable, it doesn't matter. If you twist in one direction for too long, it pulls against itself and weakens. Change the rhythm, and the force balances." The camera wobbled as the room leaned in toward the monitor showing the torque curve, perfectly flat. Then the applause began, hesitant at first, then firm. The clip ended there, but by morning it had already been uploaded to 2 engineering forums, a science education subreddit, and a social media account that specialized in unsung genius stories. The titles varied: 8-year-old outsmarts, space agency engineers, the girl who saved the tether, red thread physics, Lena's law, change the rhythm before it's too late. By midday, someone had slowed the footage, adding text overlays explaining the principle of torsional stress and how the braid reversals countered it. Others began drawing comparisons to sailing knots, climbing ropes, even ancient ship rigging. A physics professor from Colorado posted a thread breaking down Lena's technique with equations and free body diagrams, ending with, "This is elegant, simplicity hiding deep understanding." 2 days later, the story crossed into mainstream news. Television anchors replayed the moment she tied the knot. They zoomed in on her braid, the red thread gleaming under the hall lights. They marveled at her calmness, her refusal to embellish, her lack of self-promotion. A morning show host chuckled, "I can barely tie my shoelaces without making a knot in the wrong place, and this girl just rethought part of our space infrastructure." Another host added, "And she explained it using hair braiding. I love that." The attention began to find its way to the camp. At first, it was just a few visitors, a young blogger with a microphone clipped to her collar, a man with a heavy camera slung over his shoulder. Then came more, reporters with notebooks, local news crews looking for the human angle, a documentary team from Europe. They brought gifts, a spool of bright red cord for the next braid, boxes of pastries, a book about space for children, its cover glossy and bright. Lena accepted them politely but without excitement. When someone asked if she was proud of what she'd done, she shrugged. I just braided it right. If a journalist pressed her for more, what did she want to be when she grew up? Would she like to work for the space agency? She would glance toward her grandmother before answering. I don't know yet. Maybe I'll just braid. Daniel began visiting more often, partly to check on her, partly because he felt the ground shifting under both of them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the metal walls of the containers orange, he found her sitting on the steps, braiding the hair of a younger girl. They're calling it the Lena braid, he said. She didn't look up. It's just a braid. It's more than that now, he said, crouching so they were at eye level. People all over the world are talking about it. She tied off the braid with a scrap of red thread, patted the younger girl on the head, and finally met his gaze. Talking isn't the same as listening. Her words landed heavier than he expected. He thought of Keene, of the polished conference room where her work had been presented without her name. Public noise wasn't the same as recognition. It could be twisted just as easily as a cable if pulled too long in one direction. In the weeks that followed, the video's reach only grew. A science museum in Chicago recreated her braid in a giant display, letting visitors twist and reverse thick ropes to feel the difference in tension. A group of engineering students in Tokyo built a computer simulation of her method, showing the torque balance in animated form. But the most telling change came from inside the agency itself. Daniel noticed new internal memos. All external communications regarding tether design are to be routed through the Office of Public Affairs. Any statements about origin of design improvements must be consistent with approved language. In other words, control the story. Daniel began to feel the tension between the two worlds pressing on him. Outside, Lena's braid was becoming a symbol of simplicity, of ingenuity, of the idea that valuable insight could come from anywhere. Inside, the agency was tightening its grip, avoiding her name, calling it a routine engineering improvement. One night, after another long day in the lab, he drove to the camp. The air was cool, the smell of wood smoke drifting between the rows of containers. He found Lena sitting by a small fire with her grandmother, mending a worn scarf. They're going to use your braid in the next real test, he told her. Up there. In orbit. She kept sewing, not looking up. Then it has to work. It will, he said. But when it does, I want people to know why it worked. Her grandmother glanced up, her eyes sharp in the firelight. That is a different battle. Daniel knew she was right. The tether would either hold or fail, but the truth about who had made it hold, that was a fight in another arena. In the darkness, the red thread in Lena's braid caught a flicker of firelight, a thin, glowing line against the shadows. Daniel thought of the real tether in the cold silence above Earth, and how both might be tested soon. He didn't know yet that the storm, public, political, and personal, was only just beginning. It began quietly, as storms often do, not with a shouting headline or a television special, but with a single post on a citizen science forum. The post was simple. We owe credit to Lena, the 8-year-old who first identified the flaw in the orbital tether design and demonstrated the improved braid. If the agency uses her method, her name belongs in the record. Beneath it was a link to the video from the rebuttal session. Lena's small hands looping the cable, her voice explaining in clear, plain words why the rhythm must change. The petition followed within hours. Title: Credit: Lena. Recognize the true inventor of the tether braid. On the first day, it gathered 10,000 signatures, mostly from educators, engineering students, and amateur astronomers who had been following the discussion online. By the third day, Teachers were assigning the video in physics classes as an example of practical mechanics. By the 7th day, the signature count had crossed 100,000, with notes from retired astronauts, sailing enthusiasts, and mechanical rope technicians from shipping docks in Singapore to climbing guides in the Rockies. "Her method is correct. We use the same principle to prevent climbing ropes from binding," one comment read. "Credit where it's due," wrote another. Then came the media wave. At first, it was niche science podcasts, engineering blogs, and academic Twitter threads breaking down her braid in diagrams and equations. A professor from MIT posted, "This is elegance. A complex mechanical problem solved through the lens of a simple lived skill. Watch this, and remember why we teach pattern recognition." A YouTube physics channel recreated her braid with slow-motion cameras and strain gauges, showing exactly how the reversal points balanced the torque. They titled the episode Red Thread Physics, and within 2 days it had over 1 million views. Mainstream news arrived like a tide. Morning shows replayed her tying the knot, then cut to hosts attempting to braid cables on air, with clumsy fingers and uneven results. A late-night host joked, "I can't even braid my niece's hair without a tangle, and this girl just made sure our space station doesn't spin itself apart." The audience laughed, but the applause that followed was genuine. Not everyone was on her side. Some pundits dismissed it as feel-good internet noise, or suggested that Daniel had invented the technique and was hiding behind the genius child narrative for publicity. Others worried about precedent, that giving public credit to an untrained outsider could undermine the authority of formal engineering teams. But the public appetite for the story only grew. Inside the agency, the atmosphere was changing. In the hallways, Daniel noticed the split. Some colleagues nodded to him in quiet acknowledgement, even slipping him printed copies of articles praising Lena's work. Others avoided eye contact entirely, their postures stiff, as if even being seen speaking to him might be a risk. Internal memos began circulating. All external communications regarding tether design are to be routed through the Office of Public Affairs. Any statements about the origin of design improvements must be consistent with approved language. Approved language meant no mention of Lena. At one closed-door meeting, Daniel sat 2 chairs away from Dr. Keene as the debate turned sharp. A younger researcher said, "Sir, the data from her braid matches our best simulation results. The public already knows—" Keene cut him off. "We cannot hand over the narrative to a child from a refugee camp. Do you understand what that would do to our credibility? To public trust in our vetting process?" Daniel leaned forward. "Public trust isn't the problem. They trust results, and she's the reason we have a better one." Keene's voice was like cold steel. "And you'd have us admit that after years of funded research, the breakthrough came from someone with no degree, no clearance, no affiliation? We control this story, Daniel." Daniel said nothing more. He could feel the air in the room tighten like an overwound cable. In the camp, life was changing in quieter ways. The trickle of visitors had become a stream, science students hoping to meet her, journalists with cameras, educators bringing gifts, a box of colored threads, a new comb, even a book about satellites printed in large type. Lena accepted the gifts politely, but without fuss. If asked if she was proud, she would shrug and say, "I just braided it right." If pressed about whether she wanted credit, she'd glance at her grandmother before answering, "It doesn't change how the braid works." Her grandmother handled most of the conversation, keeping the boundaries clear. But Daniel noticed the way Lena sometimes slipped away after interviews, sitting alone on the back step of their container home, braid in her lap, red thread twined around her fingers. One evening, Daniel found her there. The sun was sinking, spilling gold light over the dusty ground. "They're starting to fight over you," he said. She didn't look up from the stick she was using to draw patterns in the dirt. "I didn't ask them to." "I know," Daniel said. But you started something, and now it's bigger than the tether. She finally looked at him. Then maybe they'll listen to more than cables. By the third week, the petition had passed 200,000 signatures. A coalition of science educators issued a public statement calling for Lena to be formally credited in all technical documentation of the braid. A group of former mission specialists echoed it. And then came the announcement. The agency will hold a press conference to address recent public interest in tether improvements. Daniel read the email twice. He knew what address meant. They were being forced into a corner. The press conference would be a performance, carefully worded, tightly scripted. Whether Lena's name would cross their lips was another matter. The night before the announcement, a storm rolled over the city. Thick clouds, wind rattling window frames, the smell of rain heavy in the air. Daniel drove to the camp, headlights cutting narrow beams through the darkness. He found Lena sitting inside, the glow of a small oil lamp casting soft light over her face. She was unraveling a braid from earlier in the day, her fingers working in reverse, strand by strand. "You're taking it apart," he said. She nodded. "Sometimes you have to undo it before you can make it right." Daniel thought about the press conference, about the narrative the agency had twisted tight around itself. He wondered how much undoing it would take before the truth could breathe. Outside, the rain began to fall, tapping a steady rhythm on the metal roof. This time, the storm was not only outside. It was moving inside the agency, inside the press, inside every conversation where her name was the missing strand. And storms, Daniel knew, had a way of shaking even the most carefully anchored things. The morning of the launch began with still air and a pale gray sky over the Cape. From the observation deck, Daniel could see the towering rocket against the horizon, white paint gleaming in the filtered light. The launch pad scaffolding wrapped around it like a giant's careful hands. This was no demonstration in a lab. The payload bay contained, among other critical systems, the first orbital tether manufactured with Lena's braid reversal pattern. T-12 hours. Daniel sat in the mission prep room, badge clipped to his collar, watching engineers cycle through final checks on a wall of monitors. Each display was a window into some aspect of the mission. Fuel pressures, guidance systems, thermal controls. In the far corner, a smaller set of screens displayed the tether test plan. It wasn't a full deployment. The mission would simulate docking procedures between the core module and a supply craft, putting the tether under steady rotation and controlled torque for several hours. If the braid held, it would mark the first time the method had been proven in orbit. The press conference was scheduled for 2 hours before launch. It was unusual timing. Most agencies preferred to keep media events and mission milestones separate. But the petition had forced their hand. The public wanted answers before the rocket left the ground. Daniel took his place in the back of the briefing hall, out of the camera's sightlines. He scanned the front row for Lena, but she wasn't there. He knew why. Her grandmother had declined the agency's invitation. The woman had said simply, "We will watch from here." Dr. Keene stood at the podium, suit pressed, voice measured. Behind him, a massive screen showed the mission patch, a stylized tether looping around a small station silhouette. "As part of our ongoing commitment to safety and performance," Keene began, "this mission will carry a revised tether configuration designed to improve torque stability during prolonged docking maneuvers." Daniel's jaw tightened. He waited for the next sentence. Keene continued. "The revised configuration is based on a concept first observed and demonstrated by Lena Morales, whose insight into braid structure provided a critical starting point for our engineering refinement." It was there. Her name, spoken in the full light of cameras and microphones. The journalists reacted instantly. Questions flew. How did she come up with it? Why wasn't she credited earlier? Will she be part of the engineering team going forward? Keene dodged the second question, emphasizing the team effort that had turned her idea into a flight-ready component. But it didn't matter. The name was out, and every outlet in the room was already pushing it to their live feeds. In the back, Daniel let out a slow breath. The truth had broken through, even if imperfectly. T3 hours. In the Mission Control Center, Daniel took his console. The atmosphere was focused but tense. Launch days always were. The tether deployment test was only one part of the mission, but for him, it was the heart of it. At the camp, Lena and her grandmother were watching from a small television a reporter had brought weeks earlier. Daniel imagined her sitting cross-legged on the floor, braid over one shoulder, red thread catching the light of the screen. The countdown reached 0. The rocket lifted, a bloom of flame and cloud beneath it. On the main screen in Mission Control, the bright point of the vehicle rose against the sky. The sound delayed a few seconds even here. First stage separation confirmed. Orbit insertion nominal. Hours later, the tether test began. In orbit, the core module and the supply craft began their controlled rotation. The tether, 3 metallic strands interwoven with Lena's reversal pattern, unspooled slowly. Sensors measured torsional load, vibration, and thermal expansion. In the old design, Daniel knew, torque would have begun to creep upward after a few minutes, a slow climb toward instability. But on his monitor now, the curve was steady, flat, balanced. 10 minutes, 20, 30, the numbers barely wavered. Torque stability holding, a voice from the far console reported. Daniel allowed himself a small smile. He glanced at the clock. They had already exceeded the longest stable run of any previous tether design in this configuration. After an hour, the stability curve looked as calm as it had at minute 1. The braid had not only held, it had held perfectly. Down on Earth, the first telemetry reports were already being released to the press. Headlines began appearing. Lena's braid holds in first orbital test. 8-year-old's idea keeps spacecraft steady. Red thread in the black of space. In the camp, reporters later said, Lena had simply nodded when she heard. It worked, she said, as though there had been any doubt. As the test concluded, the tether retracted smoothly, winding back into its housing with the same balance it had maintained in deployment. No twist, no torque creep, no joint stress. In Mission Control, applause broke out, a rare breach of protocol in the stillness of operations. Daniel joined in, but quietly, his eyes still on the data feed as the last numbers came in. Later that evening, the agency released an official statement. We acknowledge the critical contribution of Lena Morales in identifying and demonstrating the reversal braid technique used in today's successful orbital tether test. Her insight exemplifies the spirit of innovation that advances spaceflight safety. It was brief, but it was on record. Her name was now part of the official history. Daniel printed the statement and slipped it into a folder. He knew papers could be lost, files could be buried, but the story was already far beyond the agency's walls. That night, after the debrief, Daniel drove to the camp. The air was cool, the ground still damp from the previous day's rain. He found Lena outside, sitting on the step, watching the stars. The small television inside was still on, voices of news anchors drifting through the open door. It worked, Daniel said. She nodded. I saw. They said your name. She was quiet for a moment. Then, it's just a name. The braid would work no matter what they called it. Daniel smiled faintly. Maybe, but now when people use it, they'll know where it came from. She looked back up at the stars. Then I hope they use it well. Somewhere up there, above the thin air and the blue curve of the Earth, a cable was spinning gently, holding 2 machines together in perfect balance, its rhythm unchanged from the way she had braided it on a worn wooden crate in a dusty alley. And on the ground, the girl who had seen the twist before anyone else sat with her red thread, still ready to braid whatever needed holding. It was a month after the launch when the package arrived. The camp rarely saw deliveries. Most mail was routed through a small post office in town, and even that was a long walk away. But this time, a white government van pulled up directly to the gate. The driver stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Delivery for Lena Morales." A few children ran to find her. She emerged from behind one of the containers, wiping her hands on her dress. She'd been helping her grandmother repair a torn fishing net. The driver handed her a large cardboard box, sealed with the agency's emblem. She held it as if it might be fragile, her fingers tracing the embossed seal before she carried it inside. Inside the box, under layers of plain brown paper, was a wooden case. The grain was smooth, the edges rounded, the latch polished to a warm gleam. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a scale model of the orbital tether, the same length and structure as the one used in the real mission, braided exactly in her reversal pattern. The strands were of fine silver-gray cord, each intersection neat and tight. On top of the model was a card. The handwriting was careful, block letters in black ink, from the small hands that kept the world from twisting apart. There was no signature. Daniel came to see her that evening. She was sitting on the step, the wooden case on her lap. The tether inside gleamed in the fading light. "They sent it," he said. She nodded. "I didn't think they would." "They didn't have to," Daniel said. "But I think someone wanted you to have this. Someone in the agency who remembers what matters." She touched the braid lightly with her fingertips. "It's strange. It looks like something I've made 100 times, but it's been up there." Daniel smiled. And it worked. Perfectly. Word of the gift spread quickly in the camp. Neighbors came by to see it, leaning in to examine the braid as if it held some secret in its weave. The children, especially the girls, looked at it with wide eyes. One asked, "Can you teach me to braid like that?" Lena's answer was simple. "Of course." And so, in the evenings, a small group began gathering outside her home. Lena would sit with them on the step, handing each a length of yarn or cord, guiding their fingers. "Left over center, right over center. Now switch. Good. Keep it even." She didn't speak of tethers or torque, but she taught them exactly what she had done. The skill would be theirs, whether they used it for hair, rope, or something far greater someday. A week later, Daniel brought her an offer. "There's a program," he explained. "They want to give you a scholarship, science classes, engineering labs, even the chance to visit the next mission prep. It's a lot of doors opening at once." Lena listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked down at her hands. "I'm not sure I want to go," she said quietly. Daniel hesitated. "Why not?" "I don't want to leave my grandmother. And I don't want to spend my life in rooms like that. I like being here. I like braiding for the girls." He nodded slowly. "It's your choice." That night, she sat with her grandmother by the fire. The older woman listened to her recount Daniel's offer. When Lena finished, her grandmother said, "Sometimes the world thinks the only way to honor a gift is to send it far away. But sometimes the gift is meant to stay and make the place where it began stronger." Lena looked at the wooden case beside her. The braid gleamed faintly in the firelight. "Then I'll stay," she said. Her grandmother smiled, the lines at her eyes deepening. "Then you've chosen well." Months later, Daniel visited again. The camp looked a little different now. There was a small shed that had been turned into a classroom, painted in bright colors by the children. Inside, lengths of cord hung from hooks on the wall, each in a different stage of braiding. A faded poster of the space station was tacked above the door. Lena was at the front, showing two younger girls how to reverse the braid without letting it loosen. She glanced up when she saw Daniel, smiling briefly before returning to her students. He waited until the lesson ended. "You built a school," he said. She shook her head. "We built it." Before he left, Daniel asked, "Do you ever wish you'd taken the scholarship?" She thought for a moment. "No. The tether is already up there. My hands don't need to be." That evening, as the sun set over the camp, Lena placed the wooden case with the model tether on a small shelf by the window. Outside, children's laughter carried in the warm air. She sat on the step with her braid over one shoulder, the red thread at its end catching the last light of day. Somewhere far above, in the black silence of orbit, the real tether was turning, holding steady, its rhythm unbroken. Down here, the girl who had first seen the twist kept braiding, one reversal at a time, teaching others to keep their own strands from pulling apart. And that was enough. Thank you for spending your time with this story. From a simple braid of hair to a tether in the silence of space. Every glance, every quiet heartbeat you shared while following Lena's journey has been a small fire keeping the tale warm. I hope it reminds us all that wisdom and kindness can take root anywhere, and sometimes the smallest hands can hold the whole world steady. Wishing you peaceful days ahead.